Good morning to our virtual audience. It gives me great pleasure as the acting director of the Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies on the St. Augustine campus of the University of the West Indies to welcome you to the 6th in our Spotlight series, which is a series of lectures by SALISES academics showcasing the research that we do on the St. Augustine campus of the Sir Lewis Institute. And of course, identifying and showcasing in a major way the research of specific fellows, their research interests, their research findings, and the relevance of their research to policy development and policy activism in the Caribbean societies, and indeed the wider global South. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to this 6th installment of our Spotlight series. And today we are going to be featuring Dr. Preeya Mohan, who is going to speak to you about implementing nationally determined contributions and assessment of climate finance in Caribbean SIDS. So far, we have had 5 previous Spotlight lectures. In April last year, April 26th to be exact, Dr. Mohan presented on natural disasters and climate shocks, building economic resilience in Caribbean SIDS. In the month of May last year, another fellow, Dr. Indira Rampasad, presented on the Caribbean Court of Justice and Regional Integration. A month later, we had Dr. Bipaya Pari presenting on disability and poverty in Trinidad. And in July last year, Dr. Godfrey St. Bernard presented on science, human population dynamics, and development policy agendas in Caribbean SIDS. Last December, a fellow who temporarily joined SALISES, Dr. Robert Stewart, presented on financing a low-carbon economy, a case for a Trinidad and Tobago Green Investment Bank. So you can see already the wide and varied research topics that have engaged the scholars and academic staff associated with the Sir Lewis Institute, SALISES, in the St. Augustine campus. So it is not surprising that today we are going to be hearing again from Dr. Mohan. And as I mentioned, she will be speaking to implementing nationally determined contributions and assessment of climate finance in Caribbean SIDS. Next month, we are likely to have Dr. Pari presenting for the 2nd time, and Dr. St. Bernard and Dr. Rampasad will follow in short order for the rest of the academic year, which ends in July 2023. SALISES has been known for its engagement with international and regional audiences in terms of sharing the research that we do and engaging in many ways allies who support the work we do. Since October the 1st, 2021, we have hosted 16 virtual SALISES forums. And these forums have been very successful. In many instances, we have eclipsed 100+ virtual participants. So we know that our efforts are having very wide reach, and we are very proud of what we have been able to do when we reflect upon the virtual forum series that we have, and of course, the Spotlight initiative, which consists of these spotlight lectures featuring SALISES academics and SALISES scholars. Just last Friday, we had a very successful event looking at the evolution of the Trinidad and Tobago Carnival product, the evolution/devolution of the Trinidad and Tobago Carnival product. And that in and of itself attracted in excess of 100 virtual participants. In a month's time, we will be having another forum that will address the issue of spirituality, religiosity, and its impact on sustainable development in Caribbean SIDS. And we hope that you will join us when we do feature that forum. That will be the 17th in our series. So we are busy and we take pride in engaging our virtual audiences and all others who would wish to witness what we are part of. So having said this, today is all about Dr. Preeya Mohan. And if I can say a few things, I would like to review Dr. Mohan's bio. And Dr. Mohan, who we are extremely proud of in terms of her academic achievements, Dr. Mohan is a senior fellow at the Sir Arthur Lewis Institute of Social and Economic Studies, the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. As a graduate of SALISES, St. Augustine, with a PhD in Economic Development Policy with high commendation, she is an applied economist skilled in the use of sophisticated econometric methods and in data analysis more generally. She has conducted research on and is widely published in a range of topics focused around Caribbean growth and development, including climate change and natural disasters, diversification, public finance, innovation and entrepreneurship, food policy, entrepreneurship and regional development, tourism economics, ecological economics, the world economy, and energy policy are some of the international peer-reviewed journals Dr. Mohan has published in. As a recipient of several research grants and awards, Dr. Mohan has worked on various research projects funded by international bodies, including the Inter-American Development Bank, the International Development Research Center, the Social Sciences Humanities Research Council of Canada. She serves as a co-editor to the Island Studies Journal, an international interdisciplinarity journal established by the University of Prince Edward Islands Institute of Island Studies. Dr. Mohan teaches and supervises graduate students in a diverse range of development topics and quantitative research methodologies, and feels that it is part of her responsibility to give back to students what she has been taught. She has presented and participated in several policy debates regionally and internationally, and sees it as paramount to Caribbean growth and development process to make public reasoned arguments that are supported by research and academic expertise. So in a nutshell, I have given you a brief sense of who Dr. Preeya Mohan is. So it is with great pleasure that I again announce the commencement of this 6th installment of our SALISES Spotlight series. And just before I end, I cannot end without informing you of 2 major events that are on the SALISES calendar within the next 2 months. The first is the 50th anniversary conference of the Black Power Revolution in Trinidad and Tobago. And that conference will be held at the University of the West Indies. There's no charge to participate, no registration fee to participate. So all and sundry are free to physically join the conference at the Dagger Auditorium at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. You can also join the conference on the 20th and the 21st of April as an online participant, as a virtual participant. The second event that I want to showcase is the 24th annual conference of SALISES. SALISES has been around for 25 years, and every year we have religiously hosted an annual conference. So the 24th annual conference is going to be held again at the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine. There is going to be a registration fee, and you can also participate virtually as well as be at the conference physically. And that conference is going to be held during the 3rd to the 5th of May 2023. During this spotlight lecture, I am going to share with all of you the relevant details pertaining to these two events. So having made these announcements, I am now pleased to invite Dr. Mohan to begin her presentation. And as usual, in Dr. Mohan's style, I am absolutely sure it will be a feast to cherish, a feast to remember in terms of its rich scholarly and academic content. So at this point, I'd like to pass on to our esteemed colleague, Dr. Preeya Mohan. So, Dr. Mohan, the floor is yours. Please commence your lecture.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon, good evening. I would like to thank Dr. St. Bernard for his leadership in spearheading this Spotlight initiative, which really provides the opportunity for us as fellows to highlight our own research. I'd also like to thank the staff at SALISES for their administrative support in bringing the event together, as well as the UE marketing and communications team. So as was said by the chair, today I will be presenting on the topic, implementing nationally determined contributions, an assessment of climate finance in Caribbean SIDS. Now, for those of you who know me and my research is usually very quantitative in nature. This research is a bit different in that it's not as quantitative, but that does not make it any less important as an important area of research for the Caribbean. So let's begin by asking the question, why should we care about studying climate change, climate finance, and Caribbean SIDS? Well, SIDS bear almost no responsibility for climate change in that they contribute less than 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions. However, given the geographic, socioeconomic, and climate profiles of these small island states, they are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And we see these impacts through increased frequency and intensity of disasters and hurricanes in particular. In the Caribbean, we see heavier rainfall. In Trinidad and Tobago, we've been also having more frequent flooding. We also see longer periods of drought, sea level rise, and coastal erosion. Now, given this vulnerability, SIDS have played a pivotal role in raising awareness of climate change on the international stage and advocating for climate action. SIDS have played an important role in the negotiating period for COP21 and entry into the historic Paris Agreement. And more recently, SIDS have played an important role in lobbying for the Loss and Damage Fund at COP27. SIDS have also been successful in securing their special circumstances as vulnerable countries in the international arena. Now, looking at the Paris Agreement and nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, the Paris Agreement back in 2020 requests that each country communicate their post-2020 climate actions, which we term the nationally determined contributions, or their NDCs. These are really national climate plans where countries seek to communicate actions to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions and adapt to the impacts of climate change, which each plan being based on their own national circumstances. So each plan will be based on each country's vulnerabilities, their capacities for implementing mitigation and adaptation action, and their own levels of economic development. These NDCs are seen as a key component for securing adoption of the Paris Agreement. And in 2020, 192 countries, together with the EU, submitted their NDCs to the UNFCCC. Now, SIDS were among the first countries globally to ratify and submit their NDCs. These NDCs are updated in 5-year cycles to become more ambitious over time. And here in the Caribbean, all countries would have submitted their intended or their first NDCs, while almost all countries have now submitted their second round of NDCs. Now, how are we going to finance these climate development plans? Well, the Paris Agreement calls for financial assistance from developed countries that have industrialized first with more financial resources to less developed countries that are disproportionately affected by the impacts of climate change. The UNFCCC requires that these developed countries provide financing that is new and additional to developing countries. And given that SIDS are listed as especially vulnerable, there are calls for the efficient access of finance by these small island states. Now, back in 2009, the Copenhagen Climate Change Conference proposed to actually quantify these financing goals. So how much exactly should these developed countries make available to developing countries, including island states? It was agreed that $30 billion would be mobilized for the period 2010 to 2012, and from the period 2020, $100 billion per year would be mobilized. Now, this target of 100 billion is far from being achieved. So there is, in fact, an international climate finance gap. And up to now, there is still no consensus on how developing countries would share in this financing responsibility, as well as no future clear roadmap as to how we are going to realize this financing goal of achieving 100 billion per year. Turning now to the climate finance literature. In the literature, climate finance is viewed as an ambiguous, diverse, and politically contentious concept. There is no fixed definition for climate finance in the literature. However, it refers to the local, national, or transnational financing from public, private, and other sources to support climate change mitigation and adaptation actions. So we are looking at financing that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, as well as finances for action that can reduce our impact of climate change or build resilience to impacts of climate change. Climate finance remains an emerging area of study in the literature. Most of the literature around climate finance is typically referred to as the gray literature, which takes the form of technical reports and consultancies. However, there are a few emerging studies in the area. Now, in the literature, it's important to distinguish between climate finance and official development assistance. Climate finance, as was conceptualized, is intended to be new and additional to official development assistance. So the flows of climate finance should be separate and apart from the flows of ODA or development assistance. And these climate finance flows should in fact be new and additional to the traditional ODA flows. However, we see that a significant fraction of climate finance in fact takes the form of ODA. 80% of the financing reported by countries for the period 2010 to 2012 was in fact ODA. Now, this lack of climate finance being new and additional may be the result of climate finance lacking an international coordination body, which currently exists for ODA. And the OECD has called for increased clarity on how the international community counts public and private financial flows towards this US 100 billion commitment and how to track these flows, all in an attempt to ensure that climate finance is in fact new and additional to ODA. Now, looking at climate finance in SIDS, climate-related finance to SIDS constitute just 2.2% of global climate finance flows. This despite SIDS being among the most vulnerable countries globally. The Pacific SIDS received the largest share of climate finance, followed by the Caribbean. In terms of where these flows go, the majority of the flows, more than 50% goes towards adaptation. And this is no surprise given the high vulnerability SIDS face to the impacts of climate change, while a much smaller portion, just 24%, goes towards mitigation. Now, in the Caribbean, our adaptation and mitigation finance has, however, been approaching similar levels in terms of having a more 50-50 split. In the literature, there are also a number of challenges identified in terms of SIDS accessing international finance. And these include institutional and policy constraints, often the reliance on a single provider for climate finance, the fragmentation of small amounts of climate finance across a large number of projects. Again, the fragmentation of small amounts of climate finance across wide sectors, limited public budget support. Also, climate finance often comes following a natural disaster, and this finance is often short-term, and there's therefore very little emphasis on long-term funding. And of course, climate projects are very costly and require long-term funding. Also, there are complex requirements and processes that SIDS must go through in order to access climate finance. And lastly, SIDS often do not have a voice in international financial institutions to lobby for their fair share of climate finance. Now, given the review of the climate finance literature, there are limited studies which evaluate the effectiveness of climate finance in meeting SIDS climate goals. There are also very little studies which seek to study the access to international climate finance by SIDS, and there is very little study on how SIDS are actually going to fund their climate finance goals. Now, looking closer to home, looking at the case of Caribbean SIDS, in my view, in the area of climate finance, Caribbean SIDS should be considered a special case, and I would explain why. The majority of Caribbean SIDS, apart from Haiti and Belize, are classified as high or upper middle income countries. So the Caribbean has a relatively high number of countries that are classified as high and upper middle income relative to other areas of SIDS, such as the Pacific region. Now, given that a large share of climate finance still comes from traditional bilateral aid channels in the form of ODA, the Caribbean receives relatively less access to international climate finance because of this high income classification. Also, because of this high income classification, Caribbean SIDS are not eligible for concessional financing from the World Bank and other donors. Now, this despite the Caribbean being identified as one of the most vulnerable regions in the world and most disaster-prone regions in the world, where we face a high debt, low growth trap for over 2 decades, and we also have very limited domestic resources. Also, more and more we see that following a disaster, the Caribbean benefits less from international aid or international debt relief. So this brings us to the objective of my study. The objective of the study is to explore the climate financing needs of Caribbean states on the implementation of their NDC targets under the Paris Agreement. And the objective for doing this is twofold. Firstly, although there is widespread discussion in policy debates on the quantities and sources of international climate finance, there is still very little comprehensive assessment in the literature on how SIDS are actually going to finance their NDC goals. Secondly, there is very little understanding in the literature of SIDS perspectives on the role of international and domestic climate finance and fiscal policy reform in addressing climate change. Now, the methodology adopted is a content analysis of the submitted NDCs by 16 Caribbean SIDS. And in conducting the content analysis, the following themes are looked at: mitigation and adaptation goals and objectives, the time frame coverage in the NDCs, the sector coverage in the NDCs, estimates of cost of implementing climate mitigation and adaptation action, a look at the dependence on international versus domestic finance in carrying out climate goals, the use of fiscal policies by Caribbean states in achieving their climate goals, and the identification of finance innovations in achieving climate goals, such as aligning private sector investment, the use of climate expenditure reviews, the use of clearer budgetary tracking, and of course, identifying new sources of finance. Now, the results I'll be presenting comes from four published papers, and these papers are published in climate policy, energy policy, and forest policy and economics. The last paper will be published in PLOS Climate, which would come out by next week or so. So the following results are an accumulation of results taken from these four studies, but essentially all of the studies would have looked at the NDCs using this sort of content analysis. So looking at the results, beginning with Caribbean SIDS mitigation targets, how are SIDS planning to reduce their own greenhouse gas emissions? So mitigation targets in the NDCs include policies and actions related mainly to reducing greenhouse gases in the renewable energy sector, mainly through renewable energy. There is also some emphasis on reducing greenhouse gases in agriculture, also in the land use change and forestry sector. Now, these mitigation targets are relative to some base year period, and there are also absolute emission targets in the NDCs. Caribbean states have set out very, very ambitious mitigation targets. For instance, Barbados, Guyana, and St. Kitts have stated that they intend to achieve 100% renewables. Antigua and Barbuda and Barbados have stated that they intend to achieve 100% electric vehicles. Antigua and Barbuda has stated that they intend that 86% of their electricity would come from new renewable sources. Belize has stated that 85% of its energy needs would come from renewables. Dominica has stated that 99% of its energy would come from renewables. And Suriname has stated that its renewable electricity share would be above 35%, and it would maintain a forest cover of 93%. Now, the coverage of mitigation targets is economy-wide in the sense that countries do intend to reduce gases across the economy, but as I said, the targets mainly focus on the energy sector and the transport sector. There are some targets in agriculture and land use change and forestry, and also the waste sector and the industrial sector have all been identified as key factors for reducing greenhouse gases. The target year for implementing these mitigation targets, it's mainly 2030. However, we do have some countries giving even closer targets of 2025 and even meeting some of these targets back in 2020. Now, these mitigation targets are mainly conditional, meaning that they cannot be implemented without the help of external finance, without external support. There is some provision for unconditional targets in the region. However, in the NDCs where unconditional targets were given by Caribbean countries, these are mainly non-monetary in nature and include things like creating the right governance and institutional structures for implementing mitigation targets, as well as making the HR resources available for the implementation of these targets. So there is a high reliance on external finance or international climate finance to meet these mitigation targets. Looking now at Caribbean SIDS adaptation targets, all SIDS on the study, apart from Grenada and Trinidad and Tobago, included adaptation targets in their climate strategies. Now, these targets are wide-ranging and include water and food security, climate smart agriculture, climate proofing of the tourism sector, making the health sector more resilient to external shocks, such as pandemics like COVID-19, coastal zone management, infrastructure development, disaster risk management, sustainable construction, natural disaster insurance schemes, and social safety nets for vulnerable population. Now, all Caribbean studies stated that their adaptation targets are conditional on outside support. So in other words, these targets cannot be implemented unless the region was to receive outside external support or access to international climate finance. Looking at the cost estimates of implementing these adaptation and mitigation measures, 8 countries in their NDCs provided estimates of mitigation adaptation, which totaled $23 billion. 5 countries provided estimates of adaptation costs, which total $28 billion, and Grenada provided an aggregate estimate of $0.2 billion to meet both its mitigation and adaptation costs. Now, this gives a grand total of $51 billion to implement mitigation and adaptation in the region, which represents 40% of the regional GDP. Now, we must bear in mind that half of the countries in the study still need to identify their NDC financing needs. Also, countries where NDC financing needs were identified, it was stated that all projects were not costed in these estimates, and so there are still mitigation and adaptation projects to be costed. So in other words, this $51 billion is actually a gross underestimation of the financing needs of the Caribbean. Now, there is heterogeneity in terms of the cost of financing across the region, in that the larger, poorer islands require a much larger share of finance. So for instance, Haiti requires 49% of the total financing commitments, while the Dominican Republic requires 34%. These countries also have extremely high climate financing needs. For instance, Haiti's financing needs are 175% of its own GDP, and Suriname's financing needs is 122% of its own GDP. Now, looking at historical climate finance commitments received over the period 2010 to 2015, we see that the Caribbean has received 1,330 million in international climate finance, which represents just 2.6% of the required 51 billion in climate finance need for the region. Now, 62% of this finance was provided as grants, while 38% came from loans. So while the grant financing is still more than the loan financing, we must bear in mind that the figures for SIDS internationally show that 80% of financing received by SIDS takes the form of grants and 20% of financing takes the form of loans. So we in the region, we actually have a figure of 38% of our financing coming from loans, whereas the average for SIDS across the world is just 20%. Now, where are we getting our climate finance to support our mitigation and our adaptation costs? Well, no surprise, contained in the NDCs, 10 countries stated that there is a total reliance on international climate finance for achieving their goals. Now, this is no surprise, given that the region has a debt to GDP ratio of 79%. We also have limited fiscal space and insufficient domestic finance. And of course, we are frequently affected by natural disasters. And when these disasters occur, governments must immediately make financing available to treat with post-disaster relief and cleanup activities. Now, the sources of international climate finance identified include the Green Climate Fund, the Climate Investment Fund, the Global Environment Facility, the Pilot Program for Climate Resilience, REDD+ financing, multilateral funds, and of course, bilateral agreements. The most popular fund, International Climate Fund, identified would have been the Green Climate Fund. However, there are very few details provided on the strategies that the region intends to adopt in accessing the Green Climate Fund. Also, a worrying trend is that the proportion of funding from the Green Climate Fund to SIDS internationally has been declining. 14% of the fund went to SIDS in 2019, while just 12% of the fund went to SIDS in 2020. Now, given that islands are highly vulnerable to climate change, a larger and urgent share of financing could be argued should be warranted to these countries. Also, the model of accessing the Global Climate Fund disadvantages many small islands. These islands have low capacity in accessing the fund. They also have limited experience and confidence in accessing the fund, and they also lack support to develop the necessary concept notes and funding proposals before they can actually access financing from the fund. Now, market mechanisms are another avenue for financing climate goals, and SIDS do mention the intention to use market mechanisms, especially international market mechanisms under the UNFCCC. In particular, they identified the Clean Development Mechanism, or the CDM. St. Lucia also identified a national level type market-based system where they intend to implement a cap and trade emission trading scheme on carbon emissions, mainly targeting the private sector. Now, in terms of this Caribbean SIDS view on market mechanisms are seen as a complementary option to implementing mitigation and adaptation costs, and not necessarily a main source of finance. Also, the literature shows that there are several problems when accessing the CDM. So CDM projects in SIDS to begin with, they are disproportionately low or lower compared to large developing countries. Also, few countries have accessed the sustainable benefits promised by the CDM. So this is countries where the CDM has already been implemented. And of course, SIDS do face barriers to accessing the CDM. So financial resources to build capacity to implement the CDM is lacking, and innovative means of project financing and risk management is also lacking. Now, we can also rely on public finance and fiscal incentives to fund our climate action. However, in the review of SIDS NDCs, there's hardly any mention of public finance. The few countries that did mention public finance would have been the Bahamas, Dominica, Grenada, St. Lucia, and St. Vincent and the Grenadines. There's also hardly any mention of fiscal policy reform in terms of implementing climate action. There's very little mention of reviewing existing fiscal incentives, especially incentives that may work against NDC goals, such as subsidies on fossil fuels. However, it must be noted that these NDCs may not necessarily be a good source of country policy, and if fiscal incentives do exist, they may not have been specifically identified in the NDC. So countries may be planning to introduce these incentives, but probably not necessarily picked up in their NDCs and hence in the study. In areas where fiscal incentives were identified to be introduced or have already been introduced, these include primarily the transport and energy sector. So in Barbados, there are many incentives for hybrid and electric vehicles, alternative fuels, and solar PV. In Guyana, there's the intention to remove import duty and tax barriers for imports of renewable energy equipment, compact fluorescent lamps, and LED lamps. Dominica intends to implement import duties and charges on imported vehicles, and also to implement environmental taxes. Grenada has fuel taxes, fuel efficiency standards, and tax reductions for solar PV and solar water heaters and the installation of energy efficient light bulbs. And St. Vincent and the Grenadines intends to reduce import duty on low emission vehicles. Now, when we speak of public finance and fiscal incentives, it's important to understand that fiscal policies and development goals should be reformed and brought into alignment with climate objectives. So country development goals such as increasing economic growth and sustainable development, creating jobs and poverty reduction, these goals should not be seen as separate and apart from climate goals, but should be seen as one and the same. And in so doing this can increase the impact of both domestic and international climate finance in helping the region achieve their climate goals. However, in the review of the NDCs, very few countries noted the importance of this finance misalignment in their public finances and their NDC goals and their own national country goals. It's helpful for governments in the region to identify what incentives and subsidies already exist and what incentives and subsidies undermine climate goals going forward. Now, taxes, any new taxes is a very contentious area when brought up, especially in the current economic climate that we are in, not just in the region, but internationally. But well-designed environmental tax reforms can actually mitigate climate change and raise the well-being of citizens. Also, fiscal policy reform, if there is to be any, should always begin with some public information campaign and of course include measures to support the most vulnerable in our population, including persons with disabilities, the elderly, women, children, youth, etc. Now, private sector financing is another source that can be used for us to further our own climate goals. Private sector financing and public-private partnerships can provide additional climate finance for us in the region. However, in the review of the NDCs, the private sector, in terms of entering into green investment, is not identified as a major priority. In Barbados, however, there are significant fiscal incentives and the private sector participating. So in the Barbados, the private sector installs solar PV and other types of renewable energy, as well as in the waste sector, and governments provide a wide range of fiscal incentives to make this happen. Other countries in their NDCs have identified that they are willing or seeking to create an enabling environment for private sector investment. In Belize, this is intended to be done through public-private partnerships. In Jamaica and St. Lucia, they are looking to actively engage private sector financing in terms of creating green jobs, green growth, green investment. And in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, there is the intention to build private sector capacity to then take on that private sector green investing. Currently in the region, our private sector finance flows mainly to high emission activities. It's important, therefore, for our governments to send the right signals to the private sector to direct their finances away from these high emission activities to low emission activities. Also, there's a need to improve the ease of doing business across the region, expand access to credit for green investments, expand adoption of green technology, and increase our knowledge and training in implementing green projects. So, given the cost estimates involved in climate mitigation and adaptation, and the sources of climate finance identified, and the challenges in accessing these sources, there is a strong indication that the demand for public and private finance for meeting adaptation and mitigation goals in the region is going to be significantly larger than the supply of climate finance. In particular, the supply of international climate finance, the area where we are most reliant, even if donors fulfill their commitment of meeting that 100 billion per year. Because the high income status of the majority of our countries in the region means that we are a low priority for this allocation of scarce international finance. So we in the region, we need to pay attention to our domestic policy reforms and seek to unlock new sources of international and domestic finance if we are to make our NDCs a reality. So I will now go into the conclusion and make some recommendations for going forward. So based on the review of the NDCs, we can see that Caribbean states have set out very ambitious mitigation and adaptation targets. We also see that the region potentially suffers a significant climate finance gap in order to meet these mitigation and adaptation targets. Now, given the challenges in accessing international climate finance and our high income status, we cannot remain dependent on international climate finance. We must instead pursue more innovative and diversified options to achieve our climate goals. We also face challenges in aligning domestic fiscal policies and other economic and regulatory incentives and private sector investment to complement and boost international climate finance. And we also struggle to use domestic policy and investment options to align finance and incentives to promote our climate goals. So how do we go forward from here? The recommendations going forward could be mainstreaming NDCs into existing development plans, as I've said, country development goals, such as increasing economic growth, creating jobs, reducing poverty, should be aligned with our climate goals. So why not create green jobs? Why not create green businesses and create opportunities of diversifying our economy into the green sector? This is not new, and some of our countries in the region do have climate development plans. Guyana has its low carbon development strategy, and Dominica has its low carbon climate resilient development strategy. We can also implement budgetary tracking and performance monitoring, looking at climate expenditure review and budget coding. This would increase transparency of our use of climate finance in the region, which can then increase donor and investor confidence to make more climate finance available to us in the region. We can also leverage our compatible private sector investment and public-private partnerships. As I've said, why not diversify and create new jobs in the green sector? Also, fiscal policy reform is important. The implementation of environmental taxes and green incentives and the removal of subsidies which work against climate goals. It's also very important to build capacity to support development of concept notes and funding proposals to access international climate funds. Also, there is untapped sources of climate finance, often overlooked by us in the region. And I would end the presentation by just speaking to these untapped sources of climate finance that we can potentially look to. So the first, I call them untapped sources because there is hardly any information on these sources in the NDCs. So we can look to the forest and land use sector for climate finance, to attract climate finance. Over half of the Caribbean SIDS, so although the Caribbean SIDS make up just 0.2% of global landmass, over half of Caribbean SIDS have forests covering over 50% of their total land area. Also, we have Guyana and Suriname being identified as among the most forested areas in the world. Also, Guyana, Suriname, and Belize being identified as high forest, low deforestation countries. Now, the land use change, and forestry sector contributes just 3% of our greenhouse gas emissions and represents a net sink in the region of 19.87 million tons of CO2 equivalent. We can tap into these vast forest resources to access financing. The Global Forest Finance Pledge was established in 2021, which seeks to promote US $12 billion for forest-related climate finance for the period 2021 to 2025. Also, REDD+ financing is an important avenue that we can tap into. REDD+ financing involves accessing finance for preventing forest degradation and forest deforestation. Currently, only 4 countries in the region are actively engaging in REDD+ financing, and this includes Belize, Dominican Republic, Guyana, and Suriname. So our smaller island states can tap into REDD+ financing as an alternative source of finance. However, to tap into these sources of finance, the region must show that it is eligible to benefit from these financing mechanisms. We, however, lack the knowledge in the land use change, and forestry sector. We are also constrained by a lack of institutional and technical capacity in the land and forestry sector. Also, in order to obtain financing for forest and land use, especially through REDD+, there is a need for forest monitoring and evaluation. So there's a need for tracking of greenhouse gas emissions in the forest sector. And we currently, the majority of our countries do not have land use and forestry data and inventory in order to provide these sorts of data for tracking to access these performance-based financing for the forestry sector. We also lack the human resources and technology to create these databases and to track our emissions out of the sector in order to attract the financing. So ocean-based climate finance is another untapped avenue. Caribbean states have one of the largest and most diverse ocean spaces globally. And ocean-based finance, or blue finance, include Blue Natural Capital Financing Facility, Blue Carbon Accelerator Fund, Blue Carbon Initiative, Debt for Climate Swaps, Blue Carbon Markets, and Blue Bonds. Again, there's a need for ocean research, identification of ocean sectors for development, such as aquaculture, biotechnology, offshore wind energy, etc. There's a need for data collection for measuring scale and performance of the ocean sector, and of course, a need for establishing natural capital accounts. We in the region have not made full use of developing our ocean economy. Another avenue for financing would be gender-responsive climate finance. The Caribbean has one of the highest female participation rates in terms of employment and firm ownership globally. Gender considerations are becoming, or have been for some time, a prominent in climate funds and funding mechanisms. The Lima Work Program on Gender was established in 2014 to achieve gender-responsive climate policy and action. Also, the Paris Agreement has a mandate for the participation of women in shaping climate policies and actions and the integration of a gender perspective. Gender bonds also represent a promising climate financing vehicle for gender-responsive climate projects. And this is the last one where I would end, and it's the most recent, the Loss and Damage Fund. Now, Caribbean SIDS, as we know, are among the most disaster-prone countries worldwide. Since 1970, a disaster inflicting damage of more than 2% of our GDP can be expected every 2.5 years. Also, climate change has meant that there's an increase in the frequency of these Category 5 type disasters. And we have been affected by damaging successive storms, such as Tropical Storm Erica and Hurricane Maria, which struck Dominica in 2015 and 2017. At COP27, the Loss and Damage Fund was established to assist countries hit by climate disasters. An official definition for loss and damage has, however, still not been finalized. And this lack of a definition, this ambiguity makes it difficult to distinguish between existing adaptation, disaster risk reduction, and humanitarian finance. And this allows developed countries to hide behind their current pledges of climate finance to support developing countries with mitigation and adaptation and aid to disasters, rather than making additional finance. So there's the fear that the financing from the Loss and Damage Fund would actually not be new and additional, but would consist of the same flows that have been traditionally passing from developed to developing countries when a disaster strikes. Also, we still need to finalize the details of the fund. How will the fund be structured? Who and how much will be paid into the fund? Who manages the fund and who is eligible to access the fund? All of these details must still be worked out. So I conclude here and I look forward to the questions.
Indeed, Dr. Mohan, Dr. Preeya Mohan, thank you very much for your presentation. It was indeed riveting, and I must say that, it is a clear indication that SALISES is the #1 place for one to access any set of formal research in a wide array of areas. And certainly yours is one of those areas where we expect SALISES in the future to really take off and be the go-to institute when one wants to do research in the area of environmental economics, when one wants to do research on managing natural habitats, and in particular, the preparation and response initiatives that may be necessary in the event that we have the natural disasters, given especially that, the Caribbean is one of the most disaster-prone regions in the world. So awesome stuff. Love everything that you delivered today. And I know that, we are in good hands once the relevant authorities take heed of the messages that were conveyed in the research that you presented today. Obviously, this presentation has been based on research findings associated with a number of papers that you have already published. So the evidence is out there. And what you did today is certainly in keeping with the mandate of the Spotlight series, where you actually drew on your research findings and presented in a keynote style, what is characteristic of your research and your plans to go further. I think, much of what you presented did reflect and did bring out your reflections, your deep reflections, and your deep interrogative skills in highlighting, some of the characteristic features that come to the fore when we think of natural habitats in Caribbean societies, and their proneness to and their vulnerability in the context of shocks that have their origins in climate events, so to speak. And therein lies the need for climate financing and all of the attendant data requirements, data collection requirements, research requirements, and indeed, the more important questions in terms of the policy imperatives that may be necessary to ensure that resilience is built or rebuilt in the event that there are disasters, and that resilience resides in the sense of preventing the disastrous outcomes that are often associated, or minimizing the ill effects of the disastrous outcomes that are often associated with climate events. So it's really a question of issues of environmental vulnerability and the capacity of Caribbean SIDS to cope in the event that these vulnerabilities manifest themselves, and what needs to be done to minimize the hurt in the event that climate events they shock our systems, because in many ways we have virtually little or no control over the intensity of some of these events, and the most we can do is be resilient and in terms of preparing for these events. And there has to be appropriate funding to make all of this happen. And you offered a host of recommendations that I thought were useful. So all in all, I think, we had an outstanding treat here today delivered by you. And I think, in the limited time that we have left, I think about 30 minutes, we have a few questions that have already appeared in the chat, and I am looking forward to posing them to you. So if I can begin, I think the first question that I remembered seeing came from Professor Michelle Maiku, and she asks, what is the main constraint facing some Caribbean SIDS in calculating the cost of adaptation? This comes from Professor Michelle Maiku, and that's her question. So I presume you can attempt to provide an answer to Professor Maiku's question.
Thank you, Dr. Silbernal, for the comments regarding the presentation. And thank you to Professor Maiku for that question. So the issue of adaptation, it's mainly a public finance issue. If we're looking at climate finance, it falls in the area of public finance, in the sense that adaptation projects such as building a seawall, making roads, let's say, less prone to flooding, these are projects that would often be implemented by the government. We're not going to get the private sector building a seawall to prevent coastal erosion. Now, when we have public funded projects, they appear in our budgets, and they appear annually in our budgets. They appear at a cost in time one, and then that cost begins to double and even triple by the time they are completed, or even some of the projects have not been implemented, but you would see rising costs. So this coming out of out of the public sector and financing from the public, issues of cost overrun and issues of inefficiency in implementing projects, these are all factors that we have to that play a role in making it very difficult to fund to calculate the funding of adaptation projects. Also, most of this calculation occurs behind the scenes. As researchers, as the public, we are often not sure how the cost of these projects, how we derive the cost of these projects. Oftentimes, the government would issue an invitation to tender. Tenders would be submitted, but we are not privy to how these costs are calculated, who are awarded projects, and how projects are completed. And all of this plays a role in modeling the cost involved in terms of implementing adaptation action. And I'll just refer back to your own inaugural lecture that we had on Wednesday, the whole issue of nature-based solutions in terms of implementing nature-based solutions for adaptation. Nature-based solutions, as you would have alluded to, are more cost-effective than, say, built environments, and these nature-based solutions help to include vulnerable groups and create jobs for those who are most vulnerable. So nature-based solutions have been becoming more prevalent in the region, and we would like to see more of that type of activity take place in terms of implementing adaptation action.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Mohan, for that response to Professor Maiku's question. And I move swiftly on to the second question that has been posed, and it has been posed by Mr. Ryan Simongal, who indicated that he arrived a bit late, but is asking, do you know why the private sector approaches to, let me start again. Do you know why private sector approaches to climate finance are not considered a priority? Is it that an entity has to pioneer a way forward on this, a proof of concept? So he's asking two questions in one, or I should say it's one question, but asking about, the prospect of two possible answers, and perhaps there might be more.
Yeah, so the issue of the private sector not being a priority, so I would like to be careful about using the term not being a priority. I think for governments in the region, we want the private sector to be a priority, or we should want the private sector to be a priority in terms of implementing climate action. Where it's not a priority is within the private sector. And why is that so? So we need to go back to not just the green private sector, but the private sector in general across the region. Our private sector is made up of a sort of two-sector approach working simultaneously. On the one hand, we have a lot of SMEs and micro firms operating, and these firms are family-owned businesses, oftentimes created out of necessity to provide employment and income to the family. Alongside that sector, we have large multinational corporations operating in the region. And these firms operate primarily in finance, tourism, energy in Trinidad and Tobago. So we have these two arms of the private sector who are not what we would call risk-taking or innovative, not just in the green sector, but in general, they are not willing to take that sort of risk. And green investment, we're talking green investment now, creating green jobs and diversifying into green sectors is even more risky than other more traditional areas. So it's important that the government work together with the private sector to create that enabling environment to make the private sector feel comfortable to invest in the sort of green jobs and green growth that we want. It's also important that the government makes available the grant financing so that there are innovators in the private sector who do have innovative green ideas. So it's important that they get access to the grant financing to make those ideas a reality. So we do want private sector investment. They are coming on board. They are slow to come on board, but by creating the right type of enabling environment, reducing the barriers, making the financing available, government and private sector can work together to create these low fossil fuel green areas that we want to see. It's also important to note that if we look at the trajectory of innovative products and innovative markets push going forward, this innovation would in fact lie in creating green products. So the private sector, to fulfill their own objective of profit making, it's important that they also shift their focus, shift their mindset to going into these green type sectors, because this is the areas that are most, let's say, emerging areas. And when we're talking private sector and climate change, we're not going to get the private sector coming on board for, let's say, an adaptation project. As I mentioned earlier, we're going to have governments mainly funding adaptation type projects. If we're talking about climate and the private sector, we're looking at mitigation type projects. So projects where we're reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So we're talking about opportunities in renewable energy. So we see in Barbados, we have the incentives being offered for firms to operate in the installation of solar. So it's important to get the private sector on board in these sort of mitigation type activities and allow them to make a profit, because that's the only way they're going to enter the market.
Thank you for the answer, your response again, Dr. Mohan. And drawing on Professor Maiku's question, Dr. Bipaya Pari, who is a junior research fellow in SALISES St. Augustine, asks, in what ways could research help with calculating cost of adaptation among Caribbean SIDS?
So research can help certainly in terms of making first of all, making the sorts of figures available. So this is actually an area of research that I intend to look at. The research intends to look at actually costing adaptation activities, costing built adaptation activities versus costing nature-based activities. And how are we going to do this research? Well, the secondary data certainly doesn't exist. As I said, most of the projects come from being funded by the government, and we often do not have that kind of information as to the budgets and the overruns and the different cost components. This would involve some sort of primary research where we're going to have to look at specific projects, interview persons on the ground as to how these projects were implemented, how they were conceptualized, the cost behind these projects, the amount, how the projects were actually funded, where did the funding come from? Did it come from government? Did it come from grants from development agencies? So that kind of primary research where we go down at the ground level can certainly build our information as to how we cost these adaptation type projects.
Okay, thank you again. And the next question comes from Jawala Rambaran, former governor of the Central Bank of Trinidad and Tobago. And he asks, has any Caribbean country established a measurement, reporting, and verification system to track climate finance flows?
So MRV systems becoming a very popular type system to implement in order to increase our transparency and to attract climate flows. They were most popular in the land use change and forestry sector. When I was speaking about the Red Plus financing, in order to access Red Plus financing, it's what we call performance-based financing. So you receive the financing because you have set up an MRV system, a measuring, report, and verification system. So you've set up this MRV system for your forestry sector, where you have actually calculated your carbon stock in that sector, and you are now verifying and reporting how you've actually increased or reduced that carbon stock, and you are rewarded when you do not emit, obviously. So Guyana has been a pioneer, not just in the region, but internationally, in terms of setting up an MRV system for its forestry sector. So back in 2009, Guyana, in a partnership with the government of Norway, would have set up its project to curb deforestation. And that initial funding was to set up this MRV system. And in setting up this MRV system, they have now been able to expand their forest finance funding from Red Plus and other types of land use and forest financing. So Guyana is used actually as a benchmark as to how an MRV system should be set up in the land use and forestry sector. And Suriname is now entering into Red Plus arrangements, and they are following very closely the steps Guyana would have taken in terms of implementing their own MRV system for the land use change and forestry sector, so that they can now access Red Plus financing. Now, MRV systems are not unique to the forestry or land sector in that they can be applied to different sectors for different uses. So Dominica, for instance, has set up an MRV system, and their MRV system is not a sector-specific system, but it's actually an MRV system to track its total climate financing commitments. So it's a system where they track their total climate finance inflows, who were the donors, how much was received, where these flows are going, what sectors are benefiting, is the most vulnerable in our society benefiting. And this MRV system allows for more efficient tracking of the finance flows, and as I said, improving transparency and accountability, which then gives our donors and investors more confidence to make more climate finance available to us.
Again, thank you very much, Dr. Mohan, for your response. And as expected, there have been quite a number of comments in the chat expressing positive remarks and quite favorable remarks about the overall presentation. We have Rand Simongal claiming that, yes, excellent presentation, by the way. We have Dr. Vipaya Pari agreeing and saying, yes, great presentation, Preeya, with an exclamation mark. So it tells you how much she thinks your presentation is a great one. And Professor Michelle Maiku, excellent presentation. She endorses the other participants. And we have the former University Director of SALISES and SALISES Regional, and the former Director of SALISES St. Augustine, Professor Patrick Watson, also agreeing that the presentation has been an excellent delivery by Preeya. He claims he learned so many new things, so many things. So far we have really good commentaries coming forward. And again, Jawala Rambaran, the former governor of the Central Bank, Trinidad and Tobago, very good presentation, Dr. Mohan. And then he goes on, he says, given the experience of Belize and Barbados, what is your view on debt for climate swaps as a mechanism to reduce high debt in Caribbean SIDS? I think, of course, a question follows his favorable remarks. So I trust you can provide an answer for him.
Yes, so the area of debt for climate swaps is a new emerging area. I mean, Mr. Rambaran has done his own fair share of work in this area, so he can probably answer better than me. But in terms of the debt for climate swaps, this is one of the untapped potential sources that I would have referred to, and I made reference to it in the blue economy. But debt for climate swaps, or nature swaps as they're being called, can actually also be implemented in the green side of things, the terrestrial economy, or the land use forestry sector. And there are some emerging initiatives, but if we want to get back into a best practice case study as to how we can do it in the Caribbean, because we are still getting our feet wet in this area, we have the issue of the blue bonds in the Seychelles, where they have been able to monetize their blue economy and be able to engage in these types of debt for climate swaps. So they have been able to quantify their natural capital accounts in the blue economy, and they have been able to say, if we preserve X capital, X natural capital, then we are relieved of certain amounts of debt. So yes, it is an avenue for accessing financing. We need to work our way up by building the right sorts of natural capital accounts and natural databases. So as I made reference to the land use sector, our forest sector, we need to have databases measuring our forest reserves, our under and above ground carbon. Similarly, for the blue sector, we need to have proper databases to measure our stock of fish, our coral reefs, etc., how we value these things. And that kind of technical work needs to happen before we can actually adopt these sorts of new types of financing.
Again, thank you, Dr. Mohan, for ably responding to the question posed by Mr. Rambaran. And I see here Ryan Simongal is asking if the slides can be shared as well. Now, this is an issue that I think, we can accommodate, but of course, if we do accommodate it, we want you to appropriately cite anything you draw from this presentation. And I'll ask Dr. Mohan if she wishes to share contacts with you, and it's a decision that she will have to make in that regard. But everyone, whenever we have these forums, these spotlight lectures, they keep asking for slides. I want it to be made quite clear that this is intellectual property. And insofar as it's intellectual property, you have to appropriately cite what you would have gained and pulled from presentations in these SALISES forums and in these SALISES spotlight lectures. And I'm sure somewhere on the slides, you would have a banner page outlining, when the presentation was made, in which forum, in which session, the date, the time, etc. So please observe these protocols in the event that you benefit from slides that are made and generated by presenters in these forums. Next, we have Heidi Tania, who is one of our PhD students here in SALISES St. Augustine. And she says, appreciate the presentation, acknowledging capacity in the various countries. What will you consider one priority that may be achievable for some of these SIDS? So that's a question from Tania, Heidi Tania. I presume you can answer, Dr. Mohan.
Well, it's a bit broad when she makes reference to capacity, but I think in terms of building capacity in the region, a priority or a first move we should make would be building capacity in terms of creating the right type of funding proposal. I think in terms of building capacity, that is something we can certainly do in the short term, train our technocrats in terms of how proposals should be built, in terms to be able to access multilateral climate financing. I think that is paramount, and it's a first key step that we need to undertake in terms of building capacity in the region.
Yes, thank you very much. And as usual, again, favorable comments. I think Professor Maiku is responding a brilliant answer, and I presume it is in connection with the question that she would have posed earlier. So she commends your answer, Dr. Mohan. And again, Mr. Rambaran, he says, Dr. Mohan, could you comment on the disconnect that 6 Caribbean countries are yet to define their NDC financing needs, yet the Caribbean region is actively lobbying for greater climate finance?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And we need to make some assumptions when saying that, because I could probably get in trouble with government officials in making that statement. So the study investigates the submitted NDCs of Caribbean SIDS, right? As researchers, our research needs to be based on some sort of data. And in this particular area of research, the data source comes from the actual submitted NDCs of Caribbean SIDS. Why did I look at the NDCs of Caribbean SIDS as my data source? Well, the NDCs are the most comprehensive climate development plans that you're going to get internationally. So it means that all countries have to submit these plans, and they're available internationally. So it makes for international comparison when doing studies. With that being said, in preparing NDCs, the UNFCCC is very lax in terms of how these NDCs are compiled and submitted. So there are no hard and fast rules as to what you include in your NDCs. There are no rules in terms of a word length. There are certainly no rules in terms of providing mitigation and adaptation costs. So this is why I'm saying that I could perhaps get in some trouble, because we may have a technocrat coming to us and saying, but we do have mitigation and adaptation costs, but it's not made publicly available, so I'm not aware of it. So if it's not in the NDCs, I would not know it's available. So to answer the question, 6 countries do not have estimated costs. Well, it could be that these governments do have estimated costs, but they're hidden somewhere and we do not have access to it. As I said, because they're not mandated to include these costs in the NDCs. And certainly if these costs exist, I would like to get access to it. Alternatively, it could be that these costs have not been estimated. That's why they're not included in the NDCs. And why are we not estimating our costs? Well, again, because it takes technical capacity to estimate the cost of implementing mitigation projects and adaptation projects. We're talking about large projects that are implemented over many years. We're talking about, let's say, a solar PV farm. We're talking about accessing energy from volcanoes. These types of projects, they're very technical in nature, and to cost them is a very, very large undertaking where we do not have the technical capacity to derive these types of costs. Now, funding agencies have not only been making funding available to implement projects, but they have also been making funding available to build the technical capacity so that we are able to cost these projects to then go to market. And I want to give some hope here in ending the answer, in that the intended NDCs, 6 countries did not submit mitigation or adaptation costs. But in the second round, where updated NDCs were submitted, the number actually decreased, and we had just 4 countries not submitting costs, and we still have a few outstanding countries to submit their updated NDCs. So I believe Guyana still needs to submit, as well as Jamaica. So hopefully we can see over time that we in the region do in fact cost our projects, and we're able to attract that climate financing because we have provided the costing for the projects.
Okay, again, thank you, Dr. Mohan, for responding to the question posed by Mr. Rambaran. And I note that there have been thank yous from Mr. Rambaran himself for your responses. I also note that there have been thank yous from Hedy Tania, from Dr. Bipaya Pari, and of course I mentioned earlier Dr. Maiku, who says, Caribbean SIDS are seeking adaptation financing, but will they use it for adaptation to climate change, or will they use it for other development initiatives? So I presume that's a question that is couched within her expression of thanks for the great work that you have done thus far. I don't know if you can address that particular concern, and then following up, we have a question from Keith Maynard, but let's hear what you have to say in response to Professor Maiku's concerns.
Yeah, the comment of whether the adaptation finance would be actually spent on adaptation project makes the point of why it's important that we align our country development strategies with our climate development strategies. So it's important that we do not view our climate development goals as being separate and apart from our national development goals. As I said, all governments would like to increase economic growth. They would like to increase employment. They would like to reduce poverty. Why not carry out these actions in a way that would take us to net zero? Why not carry out these actions in a way that we emit the lowest amount of greenhouse gas emissions? Why not carry out these actions in a way that builds our resilience to climate change impacts? So, Professor Maiku, the use of your own suggestion of nature-based solutions where we involve the communities in implementing these solutions, such as replanting of mangroves, etc. This is an area where governments can create new jobs for vulnerable groups, as well as adapt to the impacts of climate change. And we need to see the value in bringing these 2 objectives together when we speak about development in the region and sustainable development.
Okay, thank you. And I think our last question will come from my college mate from 50 plus years ago, Keith Maynard, whether he's in Trinidad and Tobago or overseas. Keith has always been supporting our forums and spotlight lectures, and he asks, is there some reason that TNT did not appear on the mitigation or adaptation list of plans? TNT is considered a high CO2 emitter. Dr. Mohan?
Yeah, yes. So, well, I have my own bias as a researcher being from Trinidad and Tobago. But yeah, in terms of reviewing of the NDCs, I have to say that the NDC submitted by Trinidad and Tobago would have been not as comprehensive compared to the NDC submitted by our fellow Caribbean countries. So we would have seen that our submitted NDCs said that we intend to reduce emissions in the energy sector. And we did say that we intend to reduce emissions in public transport. Apart from that, the targets are very loose in that there are no specific, let's say, a quantifiable target then compared to some of the other countries. As I said, it's very loose. Also, in terms of our adaptation targets, we did not include adaptation measures in our NDCs. Now, that would have been the intended or the initially submitted NDCs. We're still waiting for our round 2. So hopefully in round 2, we can do better. We can provide some more quantifiable targets in terms of meeting our mitigation and adaptation goals. I've seen statements, very positive statements from our Minister of Energy very recently in terms of our solar PV farms that we intend to introduce. So I'm hoping that in the round 2, we see some more positive quantifiable actions being included in our plan. Now, of course, we are a hydrocarbon economy, and we do still have subsidies on fossil fuels, but we have been going in the right direction in the sense that our subsidies have been being reduced. I mean, the government has been given a hard time about it in that they are pulling back the subsidies, but it is going in the right direction. At the same time, you need to be careful in terms of creating that social safety net for vulnerable populations when we take these types of decisions. But certainly as a hydrocarbon producing economy, we, Trinidad and Tobago, we need to transition into becoming that type of green economy we want to see. And I've also seen discussions about hydrogen and the hydrogen plan, and there's an IDB study on implementing hydrogen in Trinidad and Tobago. So these are all positive steps, and hopefully they're all included in our second round of the NDCs.
Well, again, I want to move toward bringing this Spotlight Series lecture to an end, but it is not without, some minor closing remarks from me, and certainly a vote of thanks, which will be delivered by Dr. Preeya Parry. I must say this was an outstanding performance by Dr. Mohan. I did not expect anything short of that. In many ways, she has perhaps surpassed my expectations, and I am sure she has done so for you as well. So kudos to Dr. Mohan for her delivery today, and especially her response to some very interesting questions, I must say. This has been the second of the Spotlight series that we have had for this academic year. The first one was on low carbon economies, done by Dr. Robert Stewart, a PhD graduate of SALISES. who was temporarily assigned as a fellow in SALISES during the last semester. And we have now heard from Dr. Mohan. Next in line will be Dr. Parry, who most likely will speak about her research in disability studies. I indicated a while ago at the beginning, I indicated that SALISES is busy and engaged in a number of conferences, upcoming conferences. I was able to find a flyer for one, which I have actually posted. That's the Black Power Conference. That is to be held the 20th to the 21st of April this year, just a little more than a month away. And a much bigger conference, the 24th Annual SALISES Conference, which showcases research done by all fellows on all branches of SALISES, whether in St. Augustine, Cave Hill, or Mona. And of course, we are allied to a number of colleagues regionally and internationally, whether in universities or in other allied organizations. They are also going to be featured. Their research will also be featured. So it's going to be a mammoth feast. And I hope that you will join us in that conference. Already, we have almost 70 abstracts, which we are at the moment going through. And you will certainly see the conference program for both events. Certainly within the next 2 weeks, you will see the conference program for the Black Power Conference. And within the next month, you are certainly going to see the conference program for the 24th Annual SALISES Conference. We do have your website addresses, and we shall keep you in touch with these developments as they come by. So having said that, I want to thank all of you in the virtual audience for your continued support of SALISES events. And we look forward to seeing you in future events, which we plan to uphold between now and the end of July. At this point, I want to now invite Dr. Preeya Parry to deliver the vote of thanks and to bring these proceedings to a close. Dr. Parry, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. Good morning, everyone. So my name is Preeya Parry. I am a Junior Research Fellow at SALISES, and I have the esteemed pleasure of giving the vote of thanks for today's forum, featuring one of SALISES' star scholars, Dr. Preeya Mohan. So I want to start off by thanking Dr. Mohan for her work on climate finance and its potential in supporting the efforts of Caribbean states in achieving nationally determined contributions under the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement. So thank you, Dr. Mohan, for your presentation. And just to use the words Dr. Simbinad used to describe your presentation, thank you very much for the treat. Secondly, I'd like to express thanks to you, the audience, for your presence and your engagement with Dr. Mohan's presentation, especially during the question and answer segment. Thank you very much for your continued support. Next, I'd like to acknowledge the team who is responsible for how smoothly the event ran. So the team consists of Ms. Joanne Green from the Marketing and Communications Office, and from within the SALISES, Ms. Katia Modes, Mr. Sheldon Warner, Mr. Ephraim Thompson, and Ms. Elsa Hamilton. Thank you all for your efforts. And last, but definitely not least, I want to recognize that the Spotlight series was something envisioned by the acting director, Dr. Godfrey Simbinad, to showcase the work of SALISES. And as you can tell from the presentation today, it's very important work which has implications on regional development and therefore deserves to be highlighted. So thank you, Dr. Simbinad, for your exceptional leadership and foresight. Again, thank you to everyone, and over to you, Chair.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Parry, for your vote of thanks, which hit the nail on the head. And we are extremely thankful to all of those who have made today's event the success it has been. I think at this point, I have very little to say, but to again thank those who attended virtually. and to assure everyone, and in particular those who would have missed today's events, that all of our SALISES forums and all of our SALISES conferences, including the Mammoth Bilingual Conference we had back in October, looking at the rights and well-being of children and young people in the Caribbean and Central America. We had over 40 papers presented at that conference, and there are at least 3 books that are going to come out of that 5-year project that SALISES had a hand in. So we are thankful for that. And of course, you can look out for all of the other events that I spoke about. Everything is on our website. Everything will be placed on our website once we have forums like these and spotlight lectures like these. You can find everything on our website. So again, thanks to all for their respective participation, and do go on to enjoy the rest of the day. And insofar as it's Friday, of course, do enjoy your weekend and a productive week to follow. So that's it for today, and do look out for the next Spotlight Series lecture that will be delivered by Dr. Preeya Parry, whom you just heard from. And of course, we are going to have her, most likely she will be speaking on the issue of disabilities in a Caribbean context. So goodbye for now, and see you at our next meeting.